My name is Mary Tyson. I'm the Director of Regional History here at the Community Library. And I'm here with Marsha Edwards. We're going to talk today about Marsha's family story. Your mother, June Oyama, was a teenager when her family was incarcerated at Minidoka. You've said before that you regret not hearing more from her about this period in her life. What is one of the stories that she did tell you or your siblings?
Well, my mom's story was a little bit unusual in that my dad's side, the Takahashi side of the family, was in Seattle. So there was a larger group of Japanese Americans living there. My mom's family, the Oyama family, was living in Petersburg, Alaska, which was a pretty small town, a few thousand people. So after Pearl Harbor, the hysteria, the wartime hysteria and the racism was really, really heightened and was really bad. So the story that affected Mom truly for the rest of her life was she was about 13 or 14 years old. So after Pearl Harbor, they came, and it was the town's officials came and arrested the adult Japanese American man. So they came to the house, arrested her dad, and they didn't know what was going on, why he was arrested. They put the men in the little city jail before moving them down to the lower 48. The little city jail was just a house. There was a jail in the back of a house. And so Mom, she was frightened. They didn't know what was going on, but she still had to go to school. So when she went to school, she had to walk by the jail, and she saw her father out the window waving at her, saying, Junie, come here. And she was embarrassed, she was ashamed, and she was confused. So she ran the opposite way from him. She didn't acknowledge him, ran the opposite way, and went to school. And from that day forward, she walked the long way to school so she wouldn't pass the jail to see him. She truly lived with that regret for the rest of her life, and that was the story. Whenever she told us that story, she would cry. But it actually got worse. So then they shipped the man from Petersburg down to the lower 48, and he was in, I believe, Lordsburg, New Mexico. He was separated from their family for about 2.5 years. In the interim, so Mom was in Petersburg with her mother, and she had an older sister who was about 20 years older and had children of her own. So then they came and arrested the adult Japanese American women. So they took my mother's mom, my mom's sister, and my sister had a young baby at that time, so her sister took the baby with her. They put those women in the jail. And so Mom, who was the oldest of, there were probably about 5 other little kids in that their families, stayed together. Mom, being the oldest, had to take care of the little kids, so anywhere from around her age, about 13, 14, down to, I think the youngest was probably about 4 or 5. My mom didn't know how to cook. She didn't know where any of her parents were, so she was afraid, and she said, I went to the neighbors, but nobody would help me. And although the period of time, they weren't separated for that long, they eventually released the adult women so that they had to come back, pack what they could carry, and then they put all the families on the ships and shipped them down to the lower 48. So the period of time that Mom was by herself taking care of the kids, I don't think was any more than perhaps a week. I never could get that time frame from Mom. But that, again, scarred her for the rest of her life. And in many ways, it was almost an arrested development type of period. As she got older, it was still alive in her mind. And even as an older woman prior to her dying, she would talk about it. And it was heartbreaking.
Yeah.
So they eventually made it down to, they shipped them to the Puyallup relocation center, and from there the families then were shipped on the train to Minidoka. And again, her dad eventually met up with them in Minidoka, but that was about 2.5 years after he was first arrested in Petersburg, Alaska. In retrospect, they thought about why he might have been arrested. First is he was a radio file. He had shortwave radio, and he did have an antenna in the backyard, so they would try to get different stations through that. So they think that they thought he was a spy.
So I'm going to go to your father, Mitsuru Takahashi, known as Mitz.
Yeah.
Yeah. What story stands out that your father told you about his life before Minidoka and then during Minidoka?
Yeah, and so their side, the Takahashi side, my dad's side of the family, his dad immigrated to Seattle in about 1913. So they lived in the in Japantown. So they were surrounded by more Japanese American families. So their internment experience was more, if you want to say, traditional, versus moms being separated and shipped down. So they were interned first in Puyallup and in Camp Harmony.
And kept together as a family unit.
Right, kept together. So they were all kept together as a family unit. My dad would have been about 15 at the time, so he volunteered to go back from Puyallup, go into Minidoka early to help set up the camps, because the camps, when they first gathered all the people, they weren't set up. There was nothing there. So he went over early to help set up the camps. And by going over early, he saw the first families going to Minidoka, so he knew he would write back to his folks saying, we'll bring heavy blankets. And he kind of knew, they knew what to expect because Dad had a preview of what was going on there. But his family, they really weren't separated. So they were all in Minidoka together. And it's funny, but in Camp Harmony in Puyallup, that's where my mom and my dad met.
Oh, they met in Puyallup.
Yeah, they met in the camp there, because her family block was close to where the Takahashi family. So they started courting at that time, and then they dated through Minidoka as well. So the families, actually, Mom became pretty close to the Takahashi side of the family as well, and really, she really grew up with them and with my dad. I mean, at such a young age, they ended up staying together and getting married after camp and after the war was over. But while they were in Minidoka, of course, that's when the military came in and recruited the young men to go in to fight for the war. And I don't know this for a fact. My dad's he was a pretty feisty guy. I'm not so sure that he would have been the one that said, I wanted to volunteer to go into the Army. But he did sign up and go into the Army, and he was part of the 100th Battalion of the 442nd. And
in the combat team or in the MIS?
Nope, he was in the infantry team.
Yeah.
And that was what changed his life forever. And both Mom and Dad, like most of the Iseis and the Niseis, they never talked about their camp experience. They really didn't. It was just shigatteganai. What happens, and you just come on, you just go with it. They never talked about it much. But as they got older, we started hearing more stories, and we started asking more questions as well. And so we learned a lot more. Well, just a few years really before they died, and I'm just so grateful that my dad's Army experience was the defining event of his life. And he was failing in health, but he was really determined to go to Washington, D.C. to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. So my husband and my niece Corey and Peter and Mom and Dad and I, we all went back together to watch the ceremony, and it was one of the proudest moments of my life, but you could tell it was one of the proudest moments of my dad's life. And it was such an emotional event. By the time that the medal was awarded, most of these men were older Niseis, and the Niseis were being wheeled in wheelchairs by their grandchildren, by their younger family members. All these older men, just so emotional being together, but finally being recognized for the service that they gave to their country.
And the bravery and
it's hard to imagine the fact that these families were incarcerated behind barbed wire with the guns pointed at them, not outside of them, like they said, to protect them. They weren't there to protect them. The guns were being pointed at these people, and yet these young men went out and actually gave their lives for the country when their families were being treated so horribly is just an amazing story.
It is an amazing story.
Really amazing. So I'm so really proud of my dad. He talked to, my dad was such a macho kind of a guy. He didn't talk much to my sisters and I, the girls, about the war, but he talked to my husband. And then a young man named Brian Yagi found my dad. Brian's uncle, Tom Yagi, was the medic who rescued Dad during the war when my dad was shot in the war. And so Brian and my dad became very good friends. And so I heard stories through Brian and through my husband Kenny. And the one story that I really remember is they went to I forgot, they were on the Gothic line, and there was one German troop that was up on a hillside, and the American military could not penetrate that troop because they were up on the hillside looking down into the valley. So they had tried and tried. So finally they sent the Dad's 100th Battalion up to infiltrate this troop. But since it was up on a steep hillside, they had to do it. They had to surprise the Germans, so they had to climb at night, and they were told, whatever you do, don't make any noise, and so climbing this steep pitch, and I'm sure the stuff that they were carrying was heavy, and it's not the modern technology that we have in climbing equipment today, but the heavy packs, their guns, their artillery, so they started in night going up the hill, and several of them were killed because they didn't make it even up to the top of the hill. And Dad said the fellow next to him fell, and as he was falling he could hear him say, "Mama."
Oh.
And then he put his hand over his mouth so he would scream.
Oh, yeah.
But so anyway, the battalion did make it up to the top, so they surprised the troops, and they were able to capture them. But that was probably the only story I've heard from my dad.
Oh.
Yeah. So again, the war event really shaped him, but I was so glad that he was able to live and receive the honor, the Congressional Medal of Honor, and then he passed away a couple of years after that.
And it was so great that the whole family could be there with him.
Yeah, it was really an honor. It really was.
Getting back to you talked about your mother and father met at Puyallup, and would they talk about that story? And then being in Minidoka together before your dad.
Yeah,
enlisted?
because they were young. They were they went to Hunt High. I do remember they talked about, when they did talk about it when we were younger, we thought camp was summer camp.
Wow. Because
they talked about it in more joyous terms. They talked about, they had dances there, and they had baseball teams and regular high school activities. Friends. They would hang out with their friends. They'd go ice skating in that irrigation pond.
Yeah.
Over at Minidoka there. It froze in the wintertime, so they would ice skate there. And then after they signed the act, I can't remember the name of the act now, where they asked them, would you pledge allegiance to the United States? Would you, swear off your allegiance to Japan, the loyalty
questionnaire?
Yeah.
Okay.
So after they signed that, then the young kids were able to leave camp and go out to work, because during the wartime, of course, the farmers there, they needed help.
Right.
So mom
labor
and dad,
shortage.
the labor shortage, yeah. So the young kids would leave camp every day, and they would go out to work on the farms, and then come back to work camps at night. So again, the way they talked about it wasn't a hardship. They made it sound fun, and it probably was a fun diversion to go out, get out with their friends, and
and have this community. And
yeah.
But it's interesting to just speak about the high points or the positive experiences to you kids, giving you that impression. That's an interesting, in retrospect. It
is really interesting, and it kind of highlights the fact that we weren't able to we didn't talk to our grandparents because there was a language barrier. Of course, they spoke mostly Japanese. We didn't speak any Japanese, and it would. Now I really wish we were able to ask them questions, because they were the ones that were their livelihoods. Their lives were just so disrupted. Mom and Dad were young, so after the war, they married and they started their lives. My grandparents, they were in the prime of their lives, and they had everything taken away from them. So I often wonder, I wish I would have talked to them what their thoughts were.
Yeah.
And that it's interesting because, and this is true of all of the Japanese Americans that went into camp, is the next generation. For example, I'm a sansei. We were not taught to speak the language. We were not taught our Japanese culture. We were given, my name was Marsha Lou Takahashi, and my brothers Steve and Vicky and sisters Vicky and Lori, we all had American names. We didn't have Japanese names. So they wanted us to just assimilate as much as we can. So
just forgetting.
Really kind of forgetting the Japanese side of our heritage, which, as we got older, and now thankfully our nieces and nephews, they've taken up the language and they've learned the culture, but right after the war, they didn't want to be Japanese, and they didn't want their kids to be Japanese.
Your mother and father married shortly after they were released from Minidoka in 1946.
Right.
And were they married in Seattle?
Yeah. So after the war, they actually, my Jichan and Bachan, the grandparents, went back to Seattle. Before the end of the camp, a lot of the young people, and my mom included, so Dad was in the Army. My mom went with her sister-in-laws, and she went to, I think, Minneapolis. Another aunt went to Chicago, but again, they were able to get out of camp early and go work in various factories in the United States because they did need workers. So they were in the Midwest and the East Coast, and then when the camps were closed, they came back and they all relocated back to Seattle. And shortly thereafter, the baby boomers started getting married, or the second generation Nisei started getting married and having families. So Mom and Dad got married at Japanese Baptist Church in Seattle. And then after that, my aunts and uncles, they all started getting married. So they were able to, again, start their lives. After the war, Dad went into business with his dad, with Jichan Takahashi, and they started a Japanese landscaping company.
And that was a new business for them.
Mm-hmm. They had done, on the Takahashi side, Jichan and Bachan had been, they'd been in the laundry business, and then Jichan had been in the gardening business. So they were manual laborers. And then after the war, they started the gardening company, Dad and my grandfather, and they worked together until retirement. So they did it. I was proud of them.
Tell us how your parents responded to the redress movement. And I don't know if your grandparents were still alive.
Yeah. I remember, again, it was another really proud moment because with the redress movement, each Japanese American that was in a camp received $20,000. And the way the monies were allocated, they paid the oldest survivors first and then on down. And so it was in the 80s, 86?
88?
88. So my grandfather was in a nursing home at the time. But he was alive, so he was one of the first to receive the letter and the check. And I don't know what happened to the letter. I know, I wish we'd kept it, but I remember that they were really proud of just, I'm not sure, I don't remember them talking about it all that much, but I remember them being really proud, and it was really, really great that Ji-chun was one of the first to receive the letter and the check. And then, of course, it trickled down to my grandmother and the rest.
So your grandfather got the check first, then your grandmother, then your father, and your
then it
mother?
would have been aunts, because my dad was actually the youngest of the 4 children.
Okay.
So my aunt, Yoshi Kanamori, she and her husband would have been next in line, and she's the aunt that I've talked with you about. She's 101 now.
Yes.
Living in Nikkei Manor in Seattle, and she's surviving under this whole quarantine, but she's really an amazing. She's the one that's left on the Takahashi side. Well, actually, on both sides. So yeah, I'm on the Takahashi side. She's the only Nisei left, and even now, she's cleaning out her little apartment in Nikkei Manor and sending us photographs and old family photos, because she's doing the same thing as we're all doing. She's cleaning out her house during the quarantine.
Many years later, in 2011, you talked about this earlier, and so I just wanted to circle back because that's the most recent. I mean, that's how long it took to get the Congressional Gold Medal, and that was so we'll just revisit it. But that was awarded in the U.S. Capitol building.
Yeah, it was.
Do you remember it?
Yeah, it was in the rotunda of the Congress building. Although I have visited D.C., I've never been to any type of special event there, and the pomp and circumstance there, the military presence, it was really, really impressive. And they took such wonderful care of the Nisei men, because it was a huge logistic undertaking. They flew all of them in, and then they had buses taking them to the World War II Memorial and then to the Rotunda, and most of the activities were in the Hilton Hotel.
Oh, I see.
And every place that you had to go, there were military people there helping them, military flags. It was really, really impressive. General Shinseki, who was one of the first Japanese-American generals in the army, was there, and I remember Dad really wanted to meet him. Shinseki did give a speech, and we tried to wait around and tried to meet him, but unfortunately we couldn't because there was another event going on. But there was another general who came, and I forgot his name now, who came and actually so many of the military people would come up to these Nisei men and shake their hands and say, I want to thank you for your service. So it was really, really, really wonderful.
Thank you, Marsha.
You're welcome.
And we'll talk again.
Thank you.